The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Adelaide Cottage, casting gentle rays across the polished wooden floors. Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat quietly in her favorite armchair, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. The silence of the early hour felt both comforting and overwhelming. It had been 3 months since she had last appeared in public, 3 months since the world had seen her radiant smile grace the covers of magazines and news broadcasts. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, scrolling through the countless messages of support that continued to flood in from around the globe. Each message was a reminder of the weight she carried, not just as a mother and wife, but as a symbol of strength for millions of people who looked up to her. The irony wasn't lost on her that while she was meant to inspire others, she was struggling to find her own footing in the darkness that had enveloped her life. The diagnosis had come like a thunderbolt on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. She remembered the sterile smell of the hospital, the way the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz with an urgency that matched her racing heartbeat. The doctor's words had echoed in her mind for weeks, "Princess Catherine, we need to discuss your treatment options." Those simple words had changed everything, not just for her, but for her family, the royal family, and the nation that adored her. William had been by her side through every appointment, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. She watched him now through the window as he played with their children in the garden, his laughter carrying on the morning breeze. Charlotte's giggles mixed with George's excited shouts as they chased their father around the swing set. Louis, still small enough to be swept up in William's arms, squealed with delight as he was spun around in circles. The sight should have filled her with joy, and part of it did. But there was also a deep sadness that seemed to color everything these days. She worried constantly about how her illness was affecting her children. George, being the eldest, had started asking more questions lately. His innocent eyes would search her face for answers she wasn't ready to give. Charlotte had become more clingy, often crawling into bed with her parents in the middle of the night, as if sensing that something fundamental had shifted in their world. Catherine set down her tea and walked slowly to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The woman reflected back at her seemed like a stranger. Her once glossy hair had lost some of its luster, and there were new lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and sleepless nights. But it was her eyes themselves that showed the most change. Where once they had sparkled with confidence and warmth, now they held a vulnerability that made her feel exposed and raw. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her private secretary, updating her on the schedule that had been cleared indefinitely. Royal engagements had been postponed, charity events had been handed over to other family members, and the carefully orchestrated machinery of royal life had been adjusted to accommodate her absence. Each cancellation felt like a small failure, another way in which she was letting people down. Her mother, Carol Middleton, had been a constant presence these past weeks. She arrived each morning with fresh flowers from her garden and a determination to maintain normalcy that Catherine found both comforting and exhausting. Today was no different. The sound of her car in the driveway signaled another day of gentle fussing and carefully crafted encouragement. "How are you feeling today, darling?" Carol asked as she bustled into the kitchen, arms full of grocery bags and flowers. Her voice carried that particular tone that mothers use when they're trying to sound casual while watching every expression on their child's face. "Better," Catherine replied, though they both knew it was only partially true. Some days were better than others, but the weight of uncertainty never fully lifted. The treatment was progressing well according to the medical team, but recovery was not just about physical healing. It was about finding herself again, about rediscovering the woman who had once walked confidently into rooms full of world leaders and dignitaries. The afternoon brought a visit from Queen Camilla, who arrived with her usual grace and a basket of books from her personal collection. They sat together in the drawing room, the autumn light creating patterns on the Persian rug between them. Camilla spoke softly about her own experiences with health scares, about the way illness could strip away everything you thought you knew about yourself and force you to rebuild from the ground up. "The hardest part," Camilla said, her voice gentle but firm, "is allowing yourself to be vulnerable. We're taught to be strong, to carry on regardless, but sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you need help, that you need time." Catherine found comfort in these words. Throughout her years in the royal family, she had been praised for her poise, her ability to handle pressure, her seemingly effortless grace under scrutiny. But, now, stripped of her public role and facing an uncertain future, she was discovering that her greatest strength might lie not in appearing perfect, but in embracing her imperfections. The evening brought the familiar routine of family dinner, bath time for the children, and bedtime stories. These moments had become precious anchors in her day, reminders of what truly mattered. As she tucked Charlotte into bed, her daughter's small hand reached up to touch her face. "Mummy, when will you not be sick anymore?" Charlotte asked, her voice small in the darkness of the bedroom. Catherine felt her heart squeeze painfully in her chest. "I'm getting better every day, sweetheart," she whispered, smoothing Charlotte's hair. "The doctors are helping me, and Daddy is helping me, and you're helping me too, just by being my beautiful, brave girl." Later that night, as William held her in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Catherine allowed herself to voice the fears that haunted her days. What if she never felt like herself again? What if the public had moved on, found other figures to admire and support? What if she could never again be the princess that everyone expected her to be? "You don't have to be anyone's idea of perfect," William murmured against her hair. "You just have to be you. The woman I fell in love with, the mother our children adore, the person who cares so deeply about others that she sometimes forgets to care for herself." His words were a lifeline in the darkness, a reminder that love didn't require perfection. As she drifted off to sleep, Catherine began to imagine what it might feel like to step back into the world, not as the flawless princess the public had placed on a pedestal, but as a woman who had faced her own mortality and chosen to keep fighting. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Her private secretary called with word that several major newspapers were planning to run stories about her condition, despite the palace's requests for privacy. The carefully maintained bubble of protection around her family was about to burst, and with it would come a level of scrutiny and speculation that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. As she hung up the phone, Catherine felt something shift inside her. The prospect of having her story told by others, of having her struggle dissected and analyzed by people who had never walked in her shoes, filled her with a fierce determination she hadn't felt in months. If her story was going to be told, she would be the one to tell it. She would speak her truth, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever faced a health crisis, for every mother who had wondered how to explain illness to their children, for everyone who had ever felt the weight of others' expectations when they could barely carry their own. The decision crystallized in her mind like morning frost on a window pane. She would speak out about her recovery, about the fear and hope that battled within her every day. She would show the world that even princesses could be vulnerable, that strength came not from never falling down, but from choosing to get back up again and again. As she looked out at her children playing in the garden, their laughter carrying on the wind, Catherine felt the first stirrings of the woman she was becoming. Not the perfect princess of public imagination, but something far more valuable, a real person who had faced her darkest moments and chosen to let them transform her rather than destroy her. The world would see her differently now, but perhaps that was exactly what both she and the world needed. The camera crew arrived at Kensington Palace on a crisp October morning, their equipment creating a small city of cables and lights in the usually pristine blue drawing room. Catherine stood at the window, watching the careful choreography of preparation, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Today would mark her return to public life, but not in the way anyone expected. She had spent weeks crafting her words with William and her closest advisors, each sentence weighed and measured for its impact. But now, facing the reality of cameras and microphones, all those carefully planned words seemed to dissolve like sugar in rain. How do you explain to a watching world that the woman they thought they knew had been quietly crumbling behind palace walls? Her hands smoothed over the simple navy dress she had chosen, a far cry from the elaborate gowns and sparkling tiaras that usually accompanied her public appearances. Today called for authenticity, not pageantry. The stylist had suggested minimal makeup to emphasize the natural changes in her appearance, but Catherine had insisted on her usual polished look. She wasn't ready to appear completely vulnerable, not yet. "Your Royal Highness," the interviewer, Sarah Mitchell from BBC, approached with a warm but professional smile. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us today. I know this can't be easy." Catherine nodded, appreciating the genuine concern in Sarah's voice. They had met several times over the years at various royal events, and Sarah's reputation for sensitivity in difficult interviews had been one of the factors in choosing her for this moment. As the final preparations were made, Catherine's mind wandered to a conversation she'd had with her father-in-law, King Charles, just days earlier. He had visited her at Adelaide Cottage, arriving unannounced in the way that had become his custom since her diagnosis. They had walked slowly through the garden, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose. "You know," he had said, pausing beside the rose bushes that were preparing for winter dormancy, "I used to think that being royal meant never showing weakness. My mother, God rest her soul, believed that the monarchy's strength came from appearing unchanging, unmoved by the storms of ordinary life." Catherine had listened carefully, knowing that Charles rarely shared such personal reflections. "But, I've learned," he continued, "that true strength comes from authenticity. The people don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be human, to show them that dignity and grace can coexist with struggle and doubt." Those words echoed in her mind now as the interviewer took her seat across from Catherine in the elegant drawing room. The cameras began to roll, and, suddenly, the months of preparation came down to this single moment. "Princess Catherine," Sarah began gently, "you've been absent from public duties for several months now. Can you tell us what's been happening in your life?" Catherine took a breath, feeling the weight of millions of eyes that would eventually watch this interview. "I've been facing the most challenging period of my life," she began, her voice steady but soft. "In May, I was diagnosed with a condition that required immediate and ongoing treatment. It's been a journey that has tested not just my physical strength, but my emotional resilience and my faith in the future." The words hung in the air, and Catherine felt a strange relief at having spoken them aloud. For months, her illness had been spoken about in whispers, in coded palace statements, in speculation and rumor. Now it was simply truth, laid bare for the world to see. "How has this experience changed you?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle but probing. Catherine considered the question, thinking of the woman who had woken up just 6 months ago, confident in her role and her place in the world. "I think I've learned that I am both stronger and more fragile than I ever imagined," she said finally. "I've discovered that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's actually a form of courage. When you're stripped of all the external things you think define you, you have to find out who you really are underneath." As the interview progressed, Catherine found herself speaking more freely than she had expected. She talked about the fear that had consumed her in those first weeks after diagnosis, the way she had lain awake at night wondering if she would see her children grow up, if William would have to face the future of kingship without her by his side. "The hardest part," she admitted, her voice catching slightly, "was watching my children try to understand why Mummy wasn't the same anymore. George asked me once if I was going to die, and I realized that my silence was more frightening to them than the truth could ever be." She described the conversation she'd had with her children, sitting them down in the nursery at Adelaide Cottage and explaining, in terms they could understand, that she was sick but that the doctors were helping her get better. Charlotte had crawled into her lap and announced that she would be Mummy's doctor too, prescribing extra hugs and bedtime stories. Louis, too young to fully comprehend, had simply patted her face with his small hands and said, "Mummy sad?" The interview revealed layers of experience that the public had never seen. Catherine spoke about the army of medical professionals who had become part of her daily life, about learning to find joy in small moments when the larger picture seemed too overwhelming to contemplate. She talked about rediscovering her relationship with William, how crisis had stripped away the formal protocols of their public life and returned them to the fundamental love that had brought them together as young people. "William has been my anchor," she said, and, for the first time in the interview, tears gathered in her eyes. "He's shown me what true partnership means. Not the glossy, ceremonial version we present at state dinners, but the real, messy, complicated love that holds you together when everything else falls apart." When Sarah asked about her return to public duties, Catherine's response surprised even herself. "I'm not the same person I was before this happened," she said. "I can't pretend to be. The woman who returns to public life will be someone who understands suffering in a way I never did before. Someone who knows what it means to face uncertainty and still choose hope." She spoke about the thousands of letters she'd received from people sharing their own stories of illness, loss, and recovery. "I realized that my experience, difficult as it has been, connects me to something much larger than royal protocol or public expectations. It connects me to the basic human experience of struggle and resilience. The conversation turned to the future, to her plans for returning to her royal duties. Catherine explained that she would be taking on new patronages focused on health advocacy and support for families facing medical crises. I want to use what I've learned to help others navigate these difficult waters, she said. Not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has walked through the darkness and found her way to a different kind of light. As the interview drew to a close, Sarah asked one final question: what would you like people to take away from your story? Catherine paused, thinking of all the people who had supported her through letters, prayers, and simple acts of kindness. I want them to know that it's okay to not be okay, she said. That asking for help is a sign of wisdom, not weakness. That healing isn't just about returning to who you were before, sometimes it's about becoming who you were always meant to be. After the cameras stopped rolling, Catherine sat quietly in the drawing room as the crew packed their equipment. The autumn light was fading outside the tall windows, casting long shadows across the room where she had just shared the most personal details of her recent struggle. William appeared in the doorway, having watched the interview from the palace's private monitoring room. His expression was a mixture of pride and concern, love and protectiveness. How do you feel? He asked, settling beside her on the sofa. Exposed, Catherine answered honestly. But also lighter somehow. Like I'd been carrying this weight for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. They sat together in comfortable silence as the palace staff restored the room to its usual state. Tomorrow, the interview would be broadcast around the world. There would be analysis and commentary, praise and criticism, speculation about what it meant for the future of the monarchy. But, tonight, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months: peace. The decision to speak publicly about her recovery had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. She was no longer the princess who had everything figured out, who glided through life with effortless grace. She was a woman who had faced her mortality and chosen to transform her pain into purpose, her vulnerability into strength. As night fell over Kensington Palace, Catherine knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The public response to her honesty was unpredictable, and returning to royal duties would require careful navigation of her new reality. But, for the first time since her diagnosis, she felt ready to face whatever came next. She had found her voice, and she was prepared to use it to help others find theirs. The morning after the interview aired, Catherine woke to find her phone buzzing with an intensity she hadn't experienced since her wedding day. Messages flooded in from around the globe, from heads of state, fellow cancer survivors, mothers who had watched the interview with tears in their eyes, and countless strangers who felt compelled to share their own stories of struggle and hope. Standing in her kitchen, still in her nightgown, Catherine scrolled through message after message. A mother in Manchester wrote about watching the interview with her teenage daughter who had been battling leukemia. A businessman in Tokyo shared how her words had given him courage to seek help for his depression. An elderly woman in a care home in Scotland thanked her for showing that it was acceptable to be afraid. The response was overwhelming, but it was also profoundly moving. Catherine had always known intellectually that her position carried influence, but seeing the direct impact of her honesty on people's lives was both humbling and energizing. She sat at her kitchen table, reading each message carefully, understanding that her decision to speak out had opened a door that could never be closed again. William found her there an hour later, tears streaming down her face as she read a letter from a young father whose wife was undergoing treatment similar to Catherine's. "I showed my children your interview," he had written. "For the first time, they understood that it's okay for daddy to cry sometimes, that being scared doesn't make you weak." "Are you all right?" William asked gently, settling beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "I'm overwhelmed," Catherine admitted. "I knew people would respond, but I didn't expect this. Every single message is someone's life, someone's pain, someone's hope. How do I honor that?" They spent the morning reading messages together, sharing particularly moving stories, and beginning to formulate ideas for how Catherine's new platform might take shape. It was clear that her interview had touched something much deeper than royal protocol or public relations. It had created a conversation about vulnerability, resilience, and the power of shared experience. The official response from Buckingham Palace was measured but supportive. A statement praised Catherine's courage in sharing her story and emphasized the royal family's commitment to supporting her in whatever form her return to public life might take. Behind the formal language was the recognition that Catherine had fundamentally altered her role as a member of the royal family, and that this change would ripple through the institution in ways that were yet to be understood. King Charles called personally that afternoon. His voice was warm with pride and something that might have been relief. "You've done something extraordinary, my dear," he said. "You've reminded us all why the monarchy matters, not because we're above human experience, but because we can use our platform to illuminate it." The conversation marked a turning point in Catherine's relationship with her royal duties. She began to see her position not as a burden of perfection to be carried, but as an opportunity to bridge the gap between privilege and common human experience. Over the following days, she started meeting with advisors to discuss how she might restructure her public role around health advocacy and support for families in crisis. Her first public engagement following the interview was carefully chosen, a visit to the Royal Marsden Hospital, where she had received some of her treatment. The decision to return to a medical setting was intentional. She wanted to demonstrate that hospitals and treatment centers were not places to be feared or stigmatized, but environments of healing and hope. The day of the visit, Catherine felt nervous in a way she hadn't experienced since her early days as a royal. Stepping out of the car at the hospital, she was aware that every gesture would be scrutinized for signs of her ongoing health, every interaction analyzed for what it revealed about her recovery. But, as she walked through the doors, something clicked into place. The patients and staff she met weren't looking for a perfect princess. They were looking for someone who understood their journey, who could speak to their experience from a place of genuine knowledge rather than charitable obligation. When she sat beside a young mother receiving chemotherapy, their conversation was different from any interaction she'd had in her previous royal visits. There was no distance, no formality, just two women who understood what it meant to face uncertainty with children depending on their strength. "The hardest part," the woman confided, "is maintaining hope when you can't see past the next treatment." Catherine nodded, remembering her own darkest moments. "I learned that hope doesn't mean believing everything will be perfect," she replied. "Sometimes it just means believing you can face tomorrow, whatever it brings." The visit extended well beyond its scheduled time. Catherine found herself in conversation after conversation with patients, families, and medical staff. Each interaction reinforced her growing understanding of how her experience had uniquely positioned her to serve in a way she never could have before. Dr. Amanda Richardson, the oncologist who had been part of Catherine's treatment team, walked with her through the children's ward. "What you're doing," she said quietly, "is giving these families permission to be honest about how difficult this is. For too long, we've expected people facing serious illness to maintain a brave face. Your openness is revolutionary." The word revolutionary stuck with Catherine as she prepared for her next engagement, a roundtable discussion with representatives from various health charities. The meeting was being held at Kensington Palace, in the same room where she had given her interview. As the participants gathered, Catherine felt the weight of expectation, but also the clarity of purpose. The discussion revealed the scope of what her new advocacy could accomplish. Leaders from mental health organizations, cancer research foundations, and family support services outlined the challenges they faced in reaching people who needed help but were too proud, too scared, or too isolated to ask for it. Catherine's story, they explained, had already begun to break down some of those barriers. "We've seen a 30% increase in calls to our helpline since your interview," reported the director of a national cancer support charity. "People who have been suffering in silence are finally reaching out." Catherine listened to each presentation, taking notes and asking questions that revealed the depth of her engagement with these issues. She wasn't approaching this as a royal patron offering ceremonial support, she was positioning herself as an active participant in addressing real problems affecting millions of people. The meeting concluded with the formation of what would become known as the Catherine Foundation, a new charitable organization focused on supporting families navigating health crises. The foundation would combine direct support services with advocacy for better policies and funding for medical and psychological care. As the participants filed out, Catherine remained behind, looking around the room where so much of her transformation had taken place. William joined her, settling into the chair that had been occupied by her interviewer just weeks earlier. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, referring not just to the new foundation, but to the fundamental shift in how she would approach her royal role. Catherine considered the question. 6 months ago, she had been a different person with different concerns. She had worried about protocol, about maintaining the image of royal perfection that seemed expected of her. Now, those concerns felt almost trivial compared to the opportunity to use her experience to help others. "I think I'm ready to be useful in a way I never was before," she said finally. "Not just as a symbol or a representative, but as someone who can actually make a difference in people's lives." That evening, Catherine sat in her study, working on the speech she would deliver at the Foundation's launch event. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter, and the bare branches of the trees reminded her of her own journey, stripped down to essentials, but preparing for new growth. Her phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar international number. When she answered, a soft American accent greeted her. "Your Royal Highness, this is Dr. Jennifer Martinez from the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to thank you personally for your interview. We've been showing it to our patients, and the response has been incredible." The conversation that followed would prove to be the beginning of an international network of collaboration between Catherine's new foundation and medical centers around the world. What had started as a personal story of recovery was evolving into a global movement toward more honest, compassionate approaches to supporting people through health crises. As Catherine hung up the phone, she realized that her illness, devastating as it had been, had ultimately led her to a deeper sense of purpose than she had ever experienced. She was no longer performing the role of a caring princess, she had become someone whose care was rooted in authentic understanding and shared experience. The woman who would step onto the stage at the Foundation launch would be forever changed from the one who had once glided through royal engagements with practiced grace. She would carry with her the knowledge of what it meant to be afraid, to face uncertainty, to rebuild oneself from the ground up. And, in carrying that knowledge, she would be able to offer something far more valuable than royal protocol, genuine hope born from genuine struggle. The January morning of the Catherine Foundation launch dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of pristine blue sky that seemed to promise new beginnings. Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching the early morning joggers in Hyde Park, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air. 6 months had passed since her interview, and today would mark the official beginning of what she had come to think of as her life's true work. The Royal Albert Hall had been chosen as the venue, its grand Victorian architecture providing a fitting backdrop for an event that would bring together cancer survivors, medical professionals, royalty, and celebrities in support of a cause that had grown far beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. The foundation had already begun its work quietly, funding research projects, supporting families, and creating networks of care that bridged the gap between medical treatment and emotional healing. Getting dressed that morning felt different from any royal engagement she had prepared for before. The midnight blue gown she had chosen was elegant but understated, with sleeves that covered the small scar on her arm where her port had been, a reminder of her journey that she wore with quiet pride rather than shame. Her jewelry was minimal, her wedding ring, the simple pearl earrings that had belonged to Diana, and a delicate bracelet given to her by a young patient she had met during one of her hospital visits. As her car pulled up to the Albert Hall, Catherine could see the crowds gathered outside. But these weren't the usual royal watchers hoping for a glimpse of glamour. Many were cancer survivors and their families, people whose lives had been touched by illness and who saw in Catherine's story a reflection of their own struggles and triumphs. Some held signs with messages of hope and gratitude. Others simply stood quietly, their presence a testament to the community that had formed around her message of vulnerable strength. Inside the venue, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The guest list read like a who's who of the medical and charitable world, but it also included ordinary people whose stories had become extraordinary through their courage. Maria Santos, a young mother from Birmingham who had written to Catherine about managing treatment while caring for twin toddlers, sat in the third row. Dr. Patel, the oncologist who had delivered Catherine's initial diagnosis with such gentle professionalism, was present with his wife. And, scattered throughout the audience were dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's early work. William squeezed Catherine's hand as they took their seats on the stage. King Charles and Queen Camilla sat in the front row, their presence lending institutional support to what was clearly Catherine's personal mission. But it was the sight of George, Charlotte, and Louis in their special section, flanked by Carol and Michael Middleton, that brought tears to Catherine's eyes. Her children had been part of this journey from the beginning, and having them witness this moment felt like completing a circle. The event began with a video montage that told the story of the Foundation's genesis. Images of Catherine from before her diagnosis flashed on the screen, radiant, confident, engaged in traditional royal duties. Then came the darker period, represented not by photographs but by testimonials from the medical team that had treated her, speaking about the courage they had witnessed and the questions she had asked about how to help others facing similar journeys. When Catherine rose to speak, the silence in the hall was absolute. She approached the podium with the same measured grace that had characterized her public appearances for over a decade, but something fundamental had changed. The woman addressing the audience was not performing the role of a caring princess, she was speaking as someone who had earned the right to talk about suffering, hope, and healing through lived experience. A year ago, she began, her voice clear and strong, I thought I understood what it meant to serve others. I believed that showing up, looking appropriate, and saying the right words constituted meaningful contribution. I was wrong. She paused, allowing the weight of her admission to settle over the audience. True service, I have learned, begins with honesty about our own vulnerabilities. It requires us to transform our pain into purpose, our fear into compassion, and our isolation into connection. When I was diagnosed, I thought my usefulness was over. I believed that a princess who couldn't maintain the illusion of perfection had failed in her fundamental duty. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she continued, fueled by the conviction that had been building throughout her recovery. But I have discovered that our greatest gifts to others often come not from our strengths, but from our willingness to share our struggles. The thousands of letters I have received, the conversations I have had, the connections that have been forged, none of this would have been possible if I had remained hidden behind a facade of untouchable competence. She spoke about the Foundation's mission, to create comprehensive support systems for families facing health crises, to fund research that approached healing holistically, and to advocate for policies that recognize the emotional and psychological needs of patients alongside their medical requirements. But, more than the practical goals, she emphasized the philosophical shift that her experience represented. We live in a culture that often equates vulnerability with weakness, that asks people facing illness to maintain optimism they may not feel and to protect others from the reality of their fear. The Catherine Foundation stands for a different approach, one that honors the full spectrum of human experience and creates space for honest conversation about what it means to face uncertainty. The speech continued for 20 minutes, weaving together personal anecdotes, policy proposals, and calls to action. Catherine spoke about meeting a father who had been afraid to cry in front of his children during his wife's illness until he saw her interview. She described a teenager who had written to thank her for making it acceptable to be scared while being brave. She outlined research initiatives that would study not just medical treatments but the social and emotional supports that aided recovery. When she concluded, the standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. But what moved Catherine most was not the applause, it was the sight of people throughout the audience wiping away tears, nodding in recognition, and reaching out to comfort the strangers sitting beside them. Her story had created a space for others to acknowledge their own struggles, and, in that acknowledgement, healing could begin. The remainder of the evening featured presentations from researchers who had received foundation grants, testimonials from families who had been supported through the foundation's services, and musical performances by artists who had been touched by cancer themselves. But the heart of the event remained Catherine's transformation from a royal figure who represented an ideal to a human being who embodied hope through authentic struggle. During the reception that followed, Catherine moved through the crowd with a confidence that surprised even herself. Each conversation felt meaningful in a way that royal small talk never had. When she spoke with Dr. Richardson about the latest research findings, she understood the implications not just intellectually but emotionally. When she listened to Maria Santos describe the challenges of single parenthood during treatment, she could offer not just sympathy but genuine understanding. The evening's most moving moment came when a group of children from the Royal Marsden's pediatric ward presented Catherine with a book they had created together. Each page contained a drawing and story about their treatment experience, and the final page featured a picture of Catherine surrounded by hearts and stars, with the caption, "Thank you for showing us it's okay to be scared and brave at the same time." As the event concluded and the guests began to disperse, Catherine found herself standing once again in the space where it had all begun, not physically, but emotionally. The Albert Hall's grand dome stretched above her like a cathedral, and she felt the presence of everyone whose journey had intersected with hers over the past year. The patients who had shared their stories, the medical professionals who had guided her healing, the family members who had supported her through the darkest moments, and the countless strangers who had reached out with their own experiences of struggle and recovery. William joined her as she stood looking up at the ornate ceiling. "How do you feel?" he asked, the same question he had posed after her interview months earlier. "Complete," Catherine answered, and, for the first time since her diagnosis, she meant it fully. "Not because I'm cured or because everything is back to normal, but because I finally understand what I'm supposed to be doing with this life, with this position, with this experience." They stood together in comfortable silence as the venue emptied around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to use her platform for meaningful change, new connections to forge between her unique position and the universal human experiences of fear, hope, and resilience. The foundation was just the beginning of what Catherine now understood would be her life's work. As they finally left the Albert Hall and stepped into the January night, Catherine felt the cold air on her face and breathed deeply. The woman who emerged from that venue was forever changed from the one who had entered royal life as a young bride. She carried with her the wisdom earned through suffering, the strength discovered through vulnerability, and the understanding that true service required not perfection, but authenticity. The princess who had once worried about meeting expectations had become a woman committed to helping others exceed their own. Her recovery was no longer just about returning to health, it was about using every aspect of her experience to create a more honest, compassionate world for others facing their own darkest moments. And, in that transformation, she had found not just healing, but purpose that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The royal car pulled away from the Albert Hall, carrying Catherine toward a future she could never have imagined when her journey began. But it was a future she now embraced with the full knowledge of what she had survived, what she had learned, and what she still had to give to a world that desperately needed the hope that could only come from someone who had faced despair and chosen to transform it into light.